Welcome to Stuff You Should Know, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hey, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Josh, and there's Chuck, and Jerry's here too, and that's the podcast that they call Stuff You Should Know.
Big.
Do I sound any different?
Yeah, no. You sound exactly the same.
Do I really? That's good, because I just got the stents out from having my deviated septum fixed once and for all.
Dude, what's it like? What's the reveal?
Well, the big reveal is that my voice didn't change, which is something I was actually really worried about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I mean, like, that's what I use as my job, and I was like, well, if
Sure.
I've got, like, my septum pressed all the way up against one side of my face, how's that make my voice sound, and what will it sound like with, out that happening? But I can breathe through both nostrils for the first time in memory. I literally can't remember the last time I probably was sixth grade. Again, my friend Sami punched me in the face, and I'm almost positive that's the only thing I can come up with that would have deviated my septum. But I've been in such a good mood since those stents got pulled out, man, that I'm just on air.
Dude, I love it. So happy to hear that.
Thank you.
I bet those stents being in there was not fun.
No, it wasn't. And my doctor, a guy named Kapil Sehgal, was really, really good, as was Alicia, the PA, too. And he said that I don't think he said it was the most deviated septum ever, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that's essentially what he was saying.
Okay.
That it was a really, really deviated septum. And so he got it straight, and everything's going bully right now.
Did you shave any off anywhere here and there?
No, he said, that bump's still going to be there, right? We're not doing a rhinoplasty. I was like, yeah, I've made peace with my nose. This is fine nose. So he was like, great, okay.
I love it. I can't wait. Can't wait to breathe my breath into your nostrils and have you accept it for the first time. Here,
do it now, and we'll see if I can smell it over the microphone line. Yeah, that's nice, Chuck. It smells like seagulls.
It's funny. People listening to this might be thinking, why did Chuck almost shout the word big at the beginning of this episode?
Oh, yeah.
Because I was going to say big props and thanks to you for picking this subject.
Oh, okay, great. I'm glad you liked it.
I thought it was endlessly fascinating and had so many potential little tendrils that weren't even in the great thing that Livia put together for us.
Right.
It really got my brain kind of thinking about a lot of different ways that peripersonal space and how our brains are wired and how many things that has impacted and will impact and can impact. I loved it.
Yeah, it is. That's why I was like, we got to do one on this. I don't remember how I stumbled across. I think I actually was like, I remember hearing that every human needs like 1.7 square meters of personal space or something,
right.
Or actual physical space. And I was like, is that true? And I went and looked it up, and I stumbled upon peripersonal space, which is different. There's personal space, there's peripersonal space. And this science, even though we've been like kind of picking at the edges of it since the 70s, it's still so new that we're not quite sure if we're talking about the same thing or are these overlapping systems. But the upshot of it, peripersonal space, what we're talking about is the area around you that you can reach, like as far as your arm extends, and that if you stop and think about it, this is the way that we physically interact with the world. This is the space. And it changes because we move around the world. We sit down, we stand up, we shake hands, we do stuff. So it moves with us. It's locked into our body. But it's the space where we interface with reality, essentially, in any physical way.
Yeah, and it's and by the way, teaser, there are two other kinds of spaces that you didn't even mention that we're going to talk about.
Okay.
So just, put that under your lid.
And smoke it.
Listening audience. It's sort of related to what's called body schema. And we'll talk about sort of the history and all this and all these cool studies. But body schema is just the understanding that we have of how we're built. Like, it's like if you put on one of those big sumo wrestling suits, you're going to be knocking stuff over like a Nathan For You episode in a China shop, because your brain is wired to be used to how big you are. Like when we squeeze through a sideways thing, like we know, like I've got to turn sideways when I get to this thing because I know how big I am and I know how wide I am. And like you can't overstate the massive importance this had evolutionarily speaking, I think, because that relates to everything from, along with PPS, peripersonal space, everything from like, can I reach from this limb out to get that piece of fruit without falling and killing myself to can I use this club, and we'll get into some really interesting stuff about extensions of your own space. Can I use this club to hit that guy before he gets to me? All of this stuff matter. Like even fruit flies have a version of body schema, which is, can I make it from here to there, essentially, with my little fruit fly body?
Can I get through that gap? Is it too small?
Same as
that,
us.
Yeah, and that reveals that body schema is a really, really ancient mechanism. It's a really ancient system among life, right? That if you stop and think about it, anything that moves through the world probably has some form of body schema, because otherwise they'd be running into stuff. They would be, they wouldn't be able to feed themselves. They would miss the prey that they were running after.
Yeah.
It would
Everything.
Like, it's really basically impossible to overstate how constantly we use this process and how constant it's updated. And the most remarkable thing about it is we do all this without even giving it a thought. It just happens. And it's not just body schema we're talking about. And this is where we kind of get into what I was talking about earlier, that we're still not quite sure is body schema part of it? Are we talking about body schema and we're just accidentally using a different term? Like that's where the field is right now. But like neurology has definitely taken up peripersonal space and is investigating it with full gusto. So it probably won't be too terribly long before we understand it much more and have like a much more precise definition that all of the scientific community agrees on.
Yeah, and that's basically what we're studying here and talking about today is neurology, because it's very easy to say, well, duh, of course, you can't squeeze through a certain area if it's too small for your body, but it's not instinct. It is neurons firing on an unconscious level that is telling you to do or to not attempt this thing, basically. It's very cool.
Yeah, and again, it's how we do just about everything with our bodies, like from dancing, playing sports, using
love.
a screwdriver, making love, what some people call doing it. How if somebody shoots an arrow at your face and you catch the arrow right before it hits your face without even thinking about it.
Amazing.
It's how we catch flies out of the air with chopsticks. Anything that we do physically moving has to do with this. And again, it has to do with how incredibly advanced our brains are. That's what we're finding out. That's what this whole thing reveals, is this thing that we've just taken for granted. We finally reached the point in our understanding of the universe and us and how things work. How stuff works. That we're now investigating things that we've just totally taken for granted. And what we're finding is oh my God, our brains are so ridiculously powerful that this is just fun to even talk about. And that's why we're talking about it today.
A couple of the first neurologists to sort of start poking around this peripersonal space was in 1911, a dude named Henry Head, good name, as Livia points out, and Gordon Holmes put out a paper that talked about body schema. And they were looking at it in terms of people that had brain damage. They noticed that certain kinds of brain damage would render odd ways that they might position a limb, or that they might have a sensation in a limb or something like that. So that's how they kind of launched the field of studying this body schema thing, neurologically speaking. And they also, and this is super cool, this is just one of a million cool things, they're the first ones that came up with this idea that if something is attached to your body in a way that it's moving with your body, then your brain accepts that neurologically and factors that in. So if you're wearing a 10-gallon hat, you're going to duck a little more readily because you're wearing that hat, unless you're just really dense and you just keep knocking that hat off. But eventually you're not going to be a cartoon character, and you're going to realize this large hat or this whatever I'm wearing. Like, and I remember, I think I've talked about it before in college, that one of the greatest Halloween costumes I ever saw in downtown Athens was, I kind of knew him. His name was Blake, but he was Surface Area Man one year. And he just had these huge foam discs that he made a suit out of around his arms and legs and his body.
Oh, neat.
That he took up like, maybe 15 square feet. And he would just walk around Athens bumping into things saying, I'm Surface Area Man. But it sort of ties in with this in that he went against the idea, like neurologically speaking, he would have known he can't go into the bar and not knock people over. And I'm sure he did know this. It was part of the gag. But
right.
If it's attached to you and moves with you, your brain factors that in.
Yeah, like if you stop and think about that for a second, your body schema, if you put a hat on, your body schema enlarges and changes shape to include that hat now.
Yeah.
That's astounding. That's an amazing thing that we just, again, don't even think about. So Head and Holmes were the ones who were really first kind of bringing this up. Like, hey, guys, we're taking some stuff for granted. We need to investigate this. And it was followed up in 1941 by W.R. Brain, another neurologist. Mm-hmm. And he said, hey, you know what? We kind of think of space around us as like, the door is just 3 feet in front of me, or the ceiling is a 6-foot ceiling. And we think of it in Cartesian terms, like things can be mapped out as if on a graph. And he said that's not actually how our brain encodes things. It encodes things much more simply, basically what's in grasping distance and what's in walking distance. And he kind of prefigured all the way back in 1941 this idea of peripersonal space, grasping distance, and then other types of space. And it seems to be the case that is kind of how our brain divides things. And it's not binary like that. It's not like a straight line, like either it's in walking distance or it's in grasping distance. There's gradients of it. But he was pretty smart for having come up with this, kind of seeing things differently.
Yeah, and there were a couple of philosophers, I'm sure many people have put this forward, but Colin Klein and Frédéric de Vignemont kind of threw out that, hey, I think this evolved originally out of self-defense. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense. I think even though we're so far removed from tuk-tuk and our ancestors like that, I think many people still in a place where they maybe even not feel threatened, maybe even when they're sitting in their own living room, know like, all right, the fire poker's, within grasping distance.
Sure.
Just in case someone busts in that door.
Yeah. Like
I remember being a kid and I wasn't a paranoid, worried kid at all, but I used to go into places and, all right, where's the defense weapon? In this room, what would I grab if maybe I was a paranoid, worried kid. Now that I think about it.
I'd walk into a room and be like, where's the cookies?
I would think I could throw the cookie jar at someone's head.
Wow.
But I think that's the evolutionary sort of remnant still sticking around, which is like, what can I grasp to defend myself? And your brain is sort of wired that way. Not only with us, but animals, they found out kind of do the same thing, right?
Yeah, and like that we would have taken this initial thing that it's self-defense, so there's a bubble of like protection around us that when something starts to come into it, we're like, okay, alarms are going off. And that over time, our brain was like, we can do a lot more with this. Let's figure out unique and novel ways. And that eventually evolved into being able to grasp the hot poker. And they point out, the two philosophers you mentioned, that it's not an adaptation, that's called an exaptation.
Yeah.
And we talked about it in the human intelligence episode, where the ability to remember where you set your baby down on that rock eventually evolved into wayfinding, like our ability to create mental maps and find our way around or find our way back from something. But you said something about the animals, and there was a Swiss zoo director. I'm just going to take his name, okay? I'm usually pretty generous, but I want to take this one, okay?
Please do.
Heine Hediger.
That's pretty straightforward.
It's a great name. Heine Hediger, a Swiss zoo director, started studying animals because he wanted to figure out at what like, how can you put animals into the same enclosure, but they're from different species without scaring one another to death? And so he started studying how close you could get to animals and came up with this whole kind of contribution to the eventual peripersonal understanding of space.
That's right. So what happened was Heine Hediger, you got to say both names.
Sure.
It's really hard not to, said, I want to figure out a few different things. I want to figure out how far like a predator species can be from a prey before, we'll call it the flight distance, before one of it, the prey runs away.
Right.
Or maybe fights back. We'll call that the defense distance. Or plays dead. That's critical distance. And found out that there was just a lot of consistency among different individuals within a species, which A, was interesting, but also created the definition of what a tame animal is, which is kind of cool, which is a flight distance of 0 when it comes to humans. So you can go up and pet that thing, basically. Give it a scritch.
Yeah, and Heine Hediger, you could kind of take him and set him to the side for a little bit, because his findings really kind of come to pass in proxemics, which is the personal space as most people understand it, which eventually, we'll talk about overlaps with peripersonal space. But peripersonal space, as we understand it today, was termed, I think, around 1981. And there's going to be a lot of Chuck's Italian imitations, because the Italians really, they did a lot of studying of peripersonal space. I don't know, but they just are into that kind of thing. But from the 70s to the 90s, there was a lot of sad monkey experiments. So sad. I'm like, when are we going to stop doing that? We have to figure out a different way, because it's just so ghastly if you stop and think about what they're doing to these poor monkeys. But essentially what they figured out is, WR brain was right. Our brains basically say that's near, that's far. And yes, there's, variations on the themes, but essentially that's how we see the world. And the stuff that's near is the really hot action stuff, because that's the stuff we can interact with. Right.
But also there was an Italian neurophysiologist named, do you say Giacomo or Giacomo?
Oh, I don't know. I'm going to say Giacomo.
Okay. Giacomo Rizzolatti. Basically found out that as far as the neurons of this macaque monkey goes, and ostensibly humans, obviously, that's why they're studying these monkeys to begin with, their neurons would fire if the monkey was touched, like literally touched on the skin, or the same thing would happen if a flash of light went off near its body. So we're talking about peripersonal space versus extrapersonal space. That was one of the two types that we didn't mention. Extrapersonal is out of your reach grasp, right?
Yes.
So basically found out that certain neurons react to that extrapersonal space exclusively visually, but when it came to these peripersonal neurons, they were responding to both tactile or visual stimulus in the same way.
Right. So as long as something was happening in this peripersonal space, that neuron could be stimulated by different kinds of input. Right.
That's right.
That's gonna become big in a second. There was another researcher named Michael Graziano. Chuck?
Graziano?
Actually, he's American, so I'll bet it's just Michael Graziano. And he studied macaques too with electrical currents. And this is the one that gets me. He implanted electrodes into these neurons that Rizzolatti had discovered, and said, what happens if I stimulate this? And when he stimulated the neurons that were activated within the peripersonal space, the monkeys would flinch. They would throw their hands up defensively in front of their faces. They would respond like there was a predator that was about to attack them, like it had just invaded their peripersonal space, or as Henny Heidegger would say, their defense distance, right?
Yeah, that leads to that really backs up the whole original defense mechanism thing, right?
Exactly. That's probably what it evolved from. And then when he did the opposite, if he prevented those neurons from firing, you could get as close as you wanted, and the monkey wouldn't flinch, essentially.
All right, and then 97, Rizzolatti, I believe this is where the first sort of big book around this came out. He and his colleagues put out a book called The Space Around Us, where they basically gathered up a couple of decades worth of research and said, here's what we've got so far.
Right. One of the big things that they said in that was that, hey, what we thought before is that there's all this different sensory information coming in, tactile information, audio, visual, all that stuff. And the brain is kind of bringing it all together and analyzing it and then telling the motor nerves what to do to respond. That's not right. It turns out that there are neurons that can be stimulated by visual input, by tactile input, by audio input.
Yeah.
The same neuron. It'll respond. The point isn't what kind of stimulus it is.
Yeah.
It's where it's happening. So like if something's happening in the peripersonal space, a neuron that's responsible for the peripersonal space around your right elbow, if you see something around your right elbow coming at it, like an arrow, or if an arrow is actually touching now your elbow, that same neuron is going to fire in just the same way. That was a big thing. It's not stimulus specific, it's location specific. And so that kind of changed our entire understanding of how the brain kind of processes all this stuff. It's rather than redundancy, having all these different regions taking in stuff and then having to put it together, it's, specific neurons are dedicated to specific regions no matter how that sensory input is coming in.
Well, and the cool little cherry on this sundae was they also found out that it's not just where something is located, but their neurons start firing on if it's a bow and arrow or a rake or a club or a baseball bat or a coffee cup, your brain fires on like how you're going to physically engage with that thing because of its in coordination with its physical location. So that comes up a little bit later at the end with the mirror neurons experiment. And maybe we'll just save that. That'll be a nice little teaser.
Okay, cool. Another thing that they figured out too, I'm not sure what the year was, but Andrea Serino at the MySpace Lab, a pretty great name, she found out that the size of your PPS varies depending on what part of the body is being studied. So it's different sizes around your torso or your face or your hands. And what I found just monumentally astounding, Chuck, is that the size of your PPS alters, size and shape, I believe, as you bring one PPS area into another PPS area. So like your face comes up or your hand comes to touch your face. And they think that this is to prevent your hand from getting captured by your PPS, your face's peripersonal space. And then who knows what sort of crazy cognitive sensation that would create. So there's a mechanism to prevent that from happening, to prevent your hand's PPS from merging accidentally with your face's PPS.
Right. But one thing that they kind of got wrong that they realized later on, and I think this paper came out just a few years ago in 2018, was that, and I believe, let's shout out who it was, researchers Rory Bufacci. Man, what is going on here?
I know. I
love it. And
that Rory doesn't make you. You're not expecting Bufacci after Rory,
You're not. Rory J. Bufacci and Gian Domenico Ianetti. They put forth the argument that it's not like a switch though. It's a sort of like a gradient range basically, based on the distance something is from you. So it's not like, is it within my grasping distance or is it not? Neurons can fire if it might be like if they move something a little bit closer, the way your neurons fire change.
Yeah, they've also found that it depends on if the thing is moving or if it's stationary. And if it's moving, is it moving towards you? Is it moving away?
Sure.
So there's a lot of nuance to it rather than it's either in my extrapersonal space or it's in my peripersonal space, which is kind of like the general model for years. They're finding no, it's much more nuanced than that. So Chuck, we just realized off camera, off mic,
sure, on mic,
that
to each other.
We haven't taken a break yet.
No, see, this is so fascinating. It's like we're having a good old-fashioned conversation.
Okay, well let's take that break now then and come back. Okay?
Yeah, like people do in good old-fashioned conversations. All right, so we're back. I know everyone else takes ad breaks when they have great conversations with people. So that's what we did.
Sure.
Where are we now? Are we at tools? Can we talk about tools?
Yeah, this is where it really starts to get mind-blowing.
Yeah, this is super cool because not only does your parapersonal space change automatically if you wear a 10-gallon hat,
right? But
your parapersonal space will change according to what kind of tool you're using.
Yeah.
And this is sort of what I was talking about with Tuk all of a sudden has a 4-foot club in his hand, and he now knows that animal he wants to kill or that person coming at him, the neurons are firing basically as if his arm is 3.5 feet longer.
Yes.
It includes that. And this, I think, is just like, if you just think about the development of weapons over the years.
You and weapons.
I think, well, I mean, some of this stuff was actually in our book on the chapter on the first gun. But it really, I don't know, it never occurred to me that all weapons development since the beginning of time has just been to get further and further away from your enemy.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point,
so, like,
for sure.
You have a club that you can hit some with, or a sword, and then you're backing up a little bit more, and your parapersonal space is automatically reading this in. But I'm curious about, like, when you start shooting arrows, and then guns, and then eventually long-range missiles, like, neurologically speaking, what that does, you know?
Right. But also with tools, not just weapons, but like the fact that you can use a screwdriver or hit a baseball with a bat.
It's not about violence. Like, sometimes you just want to fix a toaster.
Right. I'm like, come on, let's chill out, Chuck. Let's get it more Richard Scary than actually scary.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can use a screwdriver is not because your hand is precisely guiding that screwdriver. It seems to be because the parapersonal space of your hand is now being extended to the tip of that screwdriver. So it's almost like if you could turn screws with your finger, you're doing something very similar as far as your neurons are concerned, because they've now adopted the screwdriver as part of your hand and extended your parapersonal space around it. So your body schema has now adjusted, and you look like you have an extra finger that's really thin and really long.
There's a really cool study, again, in Italy. In 2000, Anna Berti and Francesca Frasinetti looked at a woman who had a stroke on the right hemisphere of her brain, and they did these experiments, these near and far space experiments, to see how her neurons fired when, like, reaching for something with a hand, or reaching for something, not really reaching, but using a laser pointer to extend your extrapersonal space really far out there. And I believe when she was asked to find the midpoint of a line within her parapersonal space, like with her finger maybe, she put the mark really far to the right because the right hemisphere of her brain had been damaged through the stroke. She was asked to do the same thing with this laser, and she did a really much better job. And then they gave her a stick, and I believe that she used the stick and did worse than the laser, right? But better than her finger.
Yeah, because her brain didn't adopt the laser dot as part of her body schema, but it did adopt the stick.
So it's just constantly remapping, basically.
Yeah, but it also showed that the brain treats these two places very much differently, that they're not the same as far as the brain is concerned. And it also showed that when you use a stick over a laser pointer, your brain is treating that stick like a tool. It was just really good early evidence that, we definitely change our body schema to adopt tools when we use them.
Yeah, and it sort of made me think about, along with this next study, this was not in Italy, actually. This is in Japan, around 2000, where they took monkeys again and they gave them rakes to see if they would treat a rake like an extension of their body, neurologically speaking. And they did. They could get food that was, further away just using that rake. But they also were able to use a video monitor, these monkeys would, to see an area where there would be food that they couldn't see without looking at the video monitor. And they looked at this monitor basically to see where this food was hidden, and they still use this rake as an extension. Like, it made me think of sort of like a surgeon using robotics, basically. The same thing must be happening in their brain when they're looking at a video screen and operating an extension of their, scalpel.
Yeah, I think more recent tests using virtual reality headsets have found like that. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. You can adopt something on a video screen. Your brain can and be like, this is part of my body schema for the moment. And what I thought was even more interesting, or at least as interesting, is that the same researchers found that when the monkeys were just holding the rake, their parapersonal space just shrunk back down to normal.
Right. They had
But
to be
when
using
they were,
it, right?
yes, and if they were using it as a tool, then the parapersonal space extended around it. So it has to do with like what I can't remember. One of the researchers was saying like we interact with the world and objects, and we treat objects based on what we can or can't or plan to do with those things when we interact with them in parapersonal space.
So cool.
And all of that, by the way, was in Japanese researchers at Sushi Iriki's lab.
With an Italian flair.
It's got to be for this episode.
The same thing happens like when you're in a car, if you're driving a small car, as opposed to driving like a big box truck, your neurons are going to fire differently because you're constantly trying to figure out if you can squeeze in through a space with a larger vehicle.
Dude, the very fact that we can drive a car is because of parapersonal space. Can you imagine, like, we could conceivably still drive if just knowing, like, if I turn the wheel this way or turn the wheel that way. But it would be the most harrowing experience. No one would drive. It would be so scary to drive.
Yeah.
Because the reason why it's not scary is we've extended our parapersonal space to our car now. It's nuts what our brains are willing to do when we throw technology at them.
Well, and, I've mentioned before when I drove in Australia, opposite side steering wheel, opposite side of the road, I had to really concentrate very, very hard because you are so wired to just being in a car and driving and making turns in a certain way.
Yeah.
It really shook me up, and I think stimulated. I say stimulated me. It sounds dirty. All of a sudden, I'm driving around Australia in an excited state, but that wasn't the case. But it stimulated my brain. I just felt I felt so alive.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, because you zone out so easily when you drive sometimes, when you're just taking it all for granted.
That's dangerous.
You've driven that. Yeah, it is dangerous. There was one other thing I saw that I thought was just astounding about this. It seems that your parapersonal space can basically merge with another person's under certain conditions to where you're doing synchronized motions and movements that require coming into contact with one another.
Like synchronized swimming, let's say?
No, because you're not actually touching. This would be more like a bucket brigade. Or if you're doing a baton run and you're handing off a baton, at that moment, when the baton is being passed, it's being manipulated. It's a part of two different people's parapersonal space at the same time. So you are connected to that person via parapersonal space through the baton.
Do people touch in synchronized swimming?
I think you get disqualified for that. It's frowned on.
Oh, no. I thought you were saying they did touch.
No, I'm saying not synchronized swimming because they don't touch.
Okay.
Oh, man.
I'm confused now. Do they touch or not?
They do not touch.
They just swim around near each other in the same pattern, right?
Although I have a great story. It's not synchronized swimming, but I was on a swimming team when I was a younger kid, and I was terrible. I now realize that the coaches put me in just for fun, just to get their kicks watching me swim terribly. And one of the reasons why I know that is because they put me in at backstroke, and I was the worst backstroke swimmer ever, because I would cross at least one lane, if not two, and bump into another swimmer, and we would both be so surprised we'd stop and stand up, and I would accidentally disqualify both of us, because if you stand up in the pool, if your feet touch the bottom, you're disqualified. So that was, in that case, it wasn't synchronized swimming, but we were touching.
I can picture
accidentally.
Young Josh being like, why would anyone swim backwards? This is so dumb. You can't see anything.
Just let me do the breaststroke. I can do that.
Or you develop the first backstroke rearview mirror that just like sits on your chest.
Right.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the other cool findings. Like they have found that it's not just tools, but like anxiety and your mood can change your parapersonal space. Whether or not you're interacting with someone from a different culture can. They have found that, if you're interacting with someone from a different culture, generally, you might not feel as comfortable with them being close to you as you would someone from your own culture, which explains a lot.
It definitely does. They also found that spinal injuries can reduce the size of the PPS if the person has lost the ability to control their limb.
Yeah.
And you can actually simulate this. If you have 10 hours to kill, you can just keep your leg immobilized for 10 hours, and it will temporarily shrink your peripersonal space around your leg, because your brain's basically like, oh, I guess that leg's not in use any longer.
Yeah. Well, if you're pregnant, you're going to grow that PPS because all of a sudden you have a basketball under your shirt. So it's, people think that was obviously probably an evolutionary protection measure to protect that baby in the belly.
It makes a lot of sense.
People take a wider berth around people they deem important or high status or celebrity or famous or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's not them saying, hey, I need space. It's you regarding their status and instinctively not going as close to them. Although some people are not good at that either.
No, it's true. But you're increasing your space because you're, I guess, kind of anxious around them.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
One that I saw that explains a lot, I hadn't really thought about it. It's claustrophobia. People who have claustrophobia have bigger peripersonal spaces. So it's like if you're stuffed into a drainage culvert or something. Right. Okay. That's narrower than your peripersonal space is by a lot, you could have claustrophobia. I think that's fascinating. Or I'll give you a different example. If you're kidnapped and put into a coffin and buried alive, you may feel claustrophobic because your peripersonal space is being violated.
We got pivoted away from Florida because of the hurricane for fall break, and so we went to last-minute trip to Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Oh, cool.
And this sort of stuff is all in play if you're doing Rock City and Ruby Falls, because in Ruby Falls, you're either ducking or avoiding things, or in Rock City, there are quite a few places where you're squeezing through tight areas and also ducking. So I wish it's not like I was running into things because I have, my neurons are working fine, but if you have claustrophobia, I imagine you have a hard time with places like that, or any sort of neurological condition that affects your PPS, then those places are not going to be great for you.
Yep.
You had a good time.
I was going to say there aren't that many roadside attractions from the 30s that still hold up today, but those two definitely do.
Yeah, both very cool.
Chuck, I say that we take a break and come back and talk about personal space as most people understand it. How about that?
Let's do it.
So like I was saying, personal space, as most people think of it, is like you're making me a little nervous. You're a little close talking to me or whatever. Yeah. Who was it? Judge Reinhold, the close talker on Seinfeld. That's called proxemics, and that got its name from an anthropologist, actually, a guy named Edward Hall, back in 1966. And I don't know if he adapted Heine Heidegger's distances that he came up with for animals, or if it was just like he made the same observations and came up with different labels. But he basically replicated Heidegger's thing for the swinging 60s instead.
Yeah, and when it comes to proxemics and personal space, obviously all of this depends on who it is. Like they don't do studies on like if your boyfriend or girlfriend walks into the room, like, all those rules are kind of thrown out the window. They're talking about like, strangers who don't know each other generally. And a way they might research this is having a participant like stand there and have a control walk into the room and say, hey, you just tell me when to stop. Like right when you start feeling uncomfortable to how close I am, tell me when to stop.
Shout, stop.
Yeah, which this is going to vary wildly among people, I think. in general, but I think they did find some commonalities among cultures when it comes to comfort distances. They're like I said, some people are going to have their own like really good reasons, personal hangups. Some people have neurological conditions that are going to kind of factor in. But if you're just generally talking about a person and a culture, they have found that, weirdly, I was surprised that Americans are about average with, what do they call it? Like average physical proximity.
Yeah. We're a little more than averagely comfortable with that kind of thing.
It feels like Americans are more prone than other cultures to be like, hey, like, do you mind backing off a little bit?
Yeah, but it makes sense. And there was a guy who suggested, I think it actually might have been Edward Hall, who suggested that different cities in different countries are laid out differently based on the personal space that culture has. And it would make sense in America, we're all about wide open spaces and don't fence me in and all that stuff. So I could totally see that being, American compared to like a European city where buildings are just built on top of buildings. There's little narrow alleyways that lead to charming bookshops and stuff like that. I could see that totally based on personal space that culture values without anyone having any idea that's what's doing it.
Yeah, and I had to, I value my personal space, and when I lived in LA, I had to reckon with realizing that, like, hey, in a town like Los Angeles, a melting pot like that, people are coming from all over the world, and you're going to be shopping in close proximity to them and rubbing elbows, and their lived experience wherever they came from is different than yours, bub.
Right.
And so, like, you can't, if someone grew up in India and like I'm trying to picture like a really crowded bazaar or something where people are like packed in and trying to order things, like that's a whole different experience than growing up in the Southeast in a big, huge grocery store. And so if someone creeps up on you a little bit, you got to keep that in mind as an American.
And I could see you laying there thinking that with your elbows out to the side, your hands behind your head. And then your brain says, okay, now get up and go squeeze some orange juice because it's going to be a beautiful day.
I did have a little bit of, I try to be understanding, but I got a little salty a couple of times in Chattanooga with personal space.
Really?
Well,
with the little statue elves?
My personal philosophy is if I can't like reach behind myself and get like my wallet out of my pocket without elbowing someone.
Sure, that's way too close.
Then you're too close, especially these days.
That person is using an RFID skimmer on you if they're that close to your wallet.
I also had a kid behind me that was doing the like, let's kick the guy's feet when he walks and laugh about it with his brother. And I was like, all right, be cool.
They were kicking your feet?
Yeah. One of the kids was kicking his feet and I heard him laughing to his brother. And I was like, all right, just stay cool, Chuck. This is a kid. Your kid annoys people too. And then the mom, I didn't even have to like give a dirty look. The mom was on it and was like, you need to back off of that guy.
Right.
I was like, oh, it's fine. But yes.
Right. Oh, I hadn't even noticed.
Anyway, long way of saying that people come from different cultures where they have different levels of comfort with what Edward Hall called intimate distance, which is hugging, which is great, or whispering in someone's ear, which is the worst possible thing.
Putting your tongue in someone's ear.
That can be nice. Personal distance, which is comfortable with close friends but not acquaintances. Social distance, which is like the water cooler chat.
6 feet?
6 feet. Or what they call public distance, what he called public distance. And that's, I guess, when you're like on a stage projecting and gesturing largely and stuff like that.
Yes. And it really does remarkably resemble Heine Heidegger's separation of zones for animal species. And that makes sense because we're still animals too. And so it seems like what the difference is between personal space and parapersonal space, and physically they overlap a lot, is that, and this is just me editorializing, but I think personal space is that original defensive zone that evolved, that animals have, that Heine Heidegger turned up, that we still have, again, because we're animals. And that parapersonal space is that exaptation that came out of that personal space defensive zone, and that allows us to interact with the environment in all sorts of new and amazing and interesting ways.
Yeah, I like that.
That physically they occupy the same space, but mentally, neurologically, they're distinct.
Yeah, super fascinating. I guess we can finish up on the return of mirror neurons.
Yeah, totally.
Very excited. I feel like we used to talk about mirror neurons a lot, but we had, I believe, a complete episode on them, right? Mm-hmm. And then talked about them a lot. But it's sort of the idea, and this is a reductive way of looking at it, but like seeing a football player break their leg on the TV screen might send a weird pain sensation through your own leg, or but it's the opposite side. Isn't that what they figured out? The opposite leg?
I don't know. I'm not sure. But who was it? Willis McGahee? The Miami Hurricane guy whose knee went all the way backwards?
Oh, I don't know. I was thinking Theismann. There's been so many bad sort of incidences over the year.
Yeah.
But it's the idea that these are mirror neurons, and they're picking up what has happened to someone else and like literally physically affecting you in your body.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that this would relate to peripersonal space is they think that mirror neurons help us basically create a mental construct of what we're going to do with our body, let's say with our hands, by watching someone else doing it. And they say, well, this is obviously how like stone tool making was passed down from generation to generation, because we had the ability to watch someone else do something and then do it ourselves because of this body schema and mirror neurons, which are probably very much interrelated to the point where the mirror neurons and the peripersonal space or body schema neurons are one and the same in some cases.
Yeah, and they did a study again with the monkeys, and this had to do with kind of what I mentioned at the beginning about whether or not you're going to interact with something, where they watched monkeys watching a human grab an object. So the monkeys just watching a person, like, let's say, grab an apple, and about a quarter of the mirror neurons in these monkeys fired more rapidly if the person grabbing the apple was just simply closer to the monkey. So in other words, all of a sudden the monkey says, all right, I might be interacting with this thing. So different neurons are lighting up. And when they put up a barrier, and it was a clear barrier, this is what confused me a little bit. They put up a clear barrier between the person and the monkey, and it actually did reduce those neurons lighting up just because there was a barrier there. But it was the monkey, I guess, aware of the barrier? It had to be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it could still see what the human was doing.
All right, that makes sense.
But it had shut down the possibility to the monkey's brain that it would be interacting with the apple. So a different experience happened in the monkey's brain because it wasn't trying to interact with it. It wasn't going to interact with the apple.
Super cool. I love this stuff.
Very cool. Me too, man. Peripersonal space. I'm glad we did one on it. You got anything else right now?
No, just if you see me out, give me a little room.
Yeah, for sure. Don't kick Chuck's feet.
It's weird, though, because I do like a good hug, but like someone whispering to me, and I think I have like childhood triggers for that for certain reasons I won't get into.
Okay.
But like anybody whispering, my daughter whispering in my ear, I just can't handle. I cannot handle a whisper in my ear.
I'm not sure I knew that, man.
Well, I don't mind your whisper. You're kind of the only one.
Okay, I was going to say, I feel like...
The sweet nothings.
Right.
You really do it for me.
Yeah, that Harvey's bombing episode was so good, Chuck.
See, I don't mind hearing a whisper. It's got to be in my ear.
Yeah, I understand that.
You know what
it's
I mean?
Probably because it's not just audio, it's tactile too. The air pushing on your eardrum. I mean, who knows?
Because I don't think we mentioned the final fourth type of space. What was it called? That just something close to your skin?
Pericutaneous.
Pericutaneous space.
Yes. Where that sets off a whole different set of neurons, they think, too. That's kind of like the new leading edge of this. And that reminds me, Chuck, I cannot find this essay to save my life. But it was by a philosopher, and he was basically saying, like, where do you end and the rest of the world begin? And obviously most people say your skin, but then he pointed out that there's molecular exchange, there's gas exchange through your skin. So at a point where like a air molecule is moving into your body through your skin, like, is there really any true barrier between you and the outside world? It just jogged my memory when they were talking about pericutaneous space, and I was like, I wish I could find that essay. It was one of the cooler things I've ever read. Or
that cool thing you can do, like when you close your eyes and you can feel when someone's hand gets close to your face.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, because they said it's not, you don't have to be touching.
Yeah.
It can be up to like 5 centimeters away, and that pericutaneous space is still going to give your brain information.
It's our energy, bro.
It is, man. Chakra. You got anything else?
I got nothing else. I wish we could just talk about this stuff all day. It's good stuff.
I agree, and I think everybody listening agrees, and since Chuck said good stuff, that means it's time for listener mail.
What if you're like, after we record, we can just keep chatting about it? Like, right. Oh, that's okay.
I'm not doing anything else.
I got to take a nap, too. All right. I'm going to call this license plate funny. Boy, you never know with this show what people are going to respond to.
Yeah, I know. And that one got so much.
License plates, just people loved it. It was a really, we got a lot of email about it. I think the ubiquity of some of these lend itself to that. But here we go. I love the episode on license plate, guys, despite what Josh predicted at the beginning. Because I think you said it was going to be boring or something. How wrong.
I did. Sorry.
I was surprised that you hadn't come across the lists of rejected vanity plates that you can find for different states. I'm 17, and when I got my license about a year ago, these state-kept lists of vanity license plates were almost legend in our driver's ed. I don't know if Georgia keeps track, but Utah sure does. It's still very fun to delight in your inner 6-year-old when you're reading these. My personal favorites are Lil Toot, Poops with a Z, and I can't believe this one. Oh no, I guess these are rejected, huh? I'm fartin'. Someone actually wanted a license plate that said I'm fartin'.
I like that. I would love to see that in real life.
I would too. Highly recommend you try and find a list for Georgia, guys. The ones that aren't like super racist are pretty fun to read through. Much love from Elijah, him from Provo, Utah.
Awesome, Elijah. That's really cool. Thank you for that. We totally didn't run across it, so thanks for bringing it to our attention. And speaking of Utah, Chuck, it just reminded me. Have you seen Friend of the Family on Peacock?
No, don't know anything about it.
It is off the rails. It's set in the 70s, true story, weirdo true crime in a way, but also just beyond nuts. And it has the extra bonus of my niece Mila being in it. She's one of the daughters.
Fantastic.
Check it out, though. It's really good, with or without Mila, but it's even better because Mila's in it.
Of course. And, while we're shouting out Peacock, I don't know if we ever shouted out our good friend Andy Sierra's show, The Resort.
Oh, no, we didn't. No.
Yeah, so our old friend Andy Sierra, who we got to know through the band he was in, the Henry Clay People, he and his brother Joey. Long story short, they wrote the theme song to our TV show, and we're also story editors, screenwriters for our show. Andy's the one that did the Hulu movie with Andy Samberg called Palm Springs. And he has his very own TV show that is fully on Peacock now. It's called The Resort. It was really good. Joey was a writer on it as well. And it's just a very cool, fun show. I highly recommend it. Emily and I loved it.
Well, congratulations, Andy. That's enormous.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to check that out. Thanks for telling everybody about it too, Chuck. Well, thanks for Elijah for that email. And if you want to be like Elijah and send an email that jogs our memory to talk about unrelated TV shows, we'd love that kind of thing. You can send us an email to stuffpodcast@iheartradio.com.
Stuff You Should Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.